Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to finish off today with a special selection, and that's where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. If you'd like to submit your own special selection, you can do so with the link in the description below. Today's special selection comes at us from Damien. It says, Swans, Stay Here. Here's a band we did before on the channel, though in a more accessible edition. Swans formed in '82 in New York during the decline of the no-wave scene, from which they took massive inspiration. They were pioneers of industrial rock, and trust me, their early sound is similar to rattling machinery in a factory. This song comes off their '83 debut album, Filth, where they used detuned guitar riffing, growling, shouting vocals, two basses, and metal sheets and pipes for their percussion, in addition to a standard drum set. In the '80s, this is probably the heaviest and most brutal thing you can find, including metal. So, I'm intrigued. Let's see what Swans was creating back in the '80s. Very rigid, very mechanical. Has this feeling of something very large approaching, very heavy. All right. Interesting lead into that, the vocal line. Really cool sounds. I guess that's that metal sheet that's making that sounds. Get those dotted notes in there, creating a bit of even rhythmic dissonance among the melodic dissonance. The production on that bass kick, in fact, the whole drum kit really cuts through. In stark contrast to the guitar that seems to be designed to be buried under everything. Much like yesterday's Weakling, that was a song. You guys are really putting me on the spot trying to figure out what's going on in some of these wild tracks. I guess we're going to start with Instrumentation, just because I think it's the most unique aspect here. For its time, I'm sure there's a lot of really interesting things going on, but in retrospective, looking at it through the lens of the past 4 decades, a lot of this stuff is very commonplace. But I think the instrumentation is still a unique aspect, even looking at them in retrospective. And Damien had stated that they used metal sheets and pipes for their percussion. And I think those two things really give their sound an interesting vibe. So they have the drums, the guitar, the growling. These things are fairly commonplace. There might be a bass in there too, but if there was, I didn't hear it. Maybe it was playing the same thing the guitar was. I don't know. I was trying to find it a few times and I couldn't, but I don't even remember hearing it once. But I was like hyper focused on a lot of other things that were going on. There's the bass would have been the most normal thing that was happening in here if it was playing a traditional bass line. So that might have been why I wasn't hearing it. There was a lot of other things to keep my attention. But so they have, the guitars are doing wild things. There's some pick scraping. There's a lot of dissonance underneath distortion. So there's getting this massive sonic destruction going on in what the guitars are doing. The drums, I would say, are the most normal thing here. Even the vocal delivery has grit that we've seen before, but it's a very loose grit. There's not really much of a consistency to the level of compression that he puts on his vocals, and there's no consistency into how he attacks or releases notes. Sometimes he gets these really long lead ups where he'll hold a very closed mouth note, like a yeah, and then move into the word. Other times, he might just start immediately on the opening syllable of the word. He lets some trail off, he lets some stop, and he has variety between all these too. So there's a lot of interesting looseness to the vocal delivery here. And then there's some interesting chaos in the guitar delivery. And the drums and the bass, if there is one, are kind of doing some mundane things that work for basically doing what they do in a jazz group, which would be the rhythm section. They're keeping the groove while everything else is there to experiment or to catch the listener's ear. Then we have the auxiliary percussion area, which is going to be the industrial stuff. And the metal pipe, I think, is an interesting sound, but it fills a role that is present on the drum kit. And that's more of a percussive disruption. And I think that's typically what the snare does. Cymbals tend to include brightness, a little bit of beauty. Bass kicks tend to have the groove aspect, and the snare just cuts through all of that. It is loud, it's poppy, it's got the rattle if the snare isn't turned off. Um, to me, it's not disruptive in a negative way, but it's disruptive in a way that it separates everything else the drummer is doing, and the snare is often utilized in mainstream music to designate the beat, right? We normally hear about the snare coming on 1 and 3 or 2 and 4 if we're in a 4/4 time signature, and it's there to keep the beat while the other things might be doing different ideas. The bass kick tends to utilize some grooviness, and we hear some syncopation in it. So we have that syncopation against the snare on the downbeat of all the beats or every other beat. Cymbals can get fancy, but usually snare work is not. There's definitely some genres that utilize some fancy snare work, but even in extreme metals, when we start seeing blast beats, it's heavily rigid. It provides the metronome. So it's disruptive in a way that it calls attention to itself in order to keep the beat against the groove in the ornamentation. And that's how I hear this metal pipe as well. It is loud, it's disruptive, it immediately calls attention to itself, and it has a unique timbre. But it's disruptive in a different manner, and I think it's disruptive in a sense of creating chaos, which a lot of this song kind of revels in. And I really like that idea of another element in the percussion that cuts through the noise, but this one is less structured. And just to touch on what I said about the drum kit and its roles, of course, they are not set in stone. You can use whatever part of the instrument you want for whatever you want. I'm not saying that a drummer has to work within those constraints, but those are very common roles that the cymbals, the snare, and the bass end up being in. And then we get those the metal sheets. I think I'm going to pull this back up one more time to double check. Yep, metal sheets. So those are interesting because they give that wavy, reverbery sound. Metal sheets are often used in theater to kind of give the idea of thunder. They have a lot of reverberation to them, and they can also get very loud because of the way that sound waves bounce around from what they're creating. And it's utilized here to give the song what would eventually be an electronic industrial sound. There's a lot of things in there that I associate with electronic sound effects nowadays in modern industrial music that I am kind of fascinated that they were creating physically. It's really awesome to hear that. I've always talked about that in the past, that I understand the place for digital music and digital instrumentation, but I'm also a huge fan of performers, of musicians, and that if there is a possibility for someone to play a part rather than it be played by a computer in a live setting, or even in a studio, that I would prefer to have the musician doing it. And, I've always kind of had the mind that this is a limited scope. Obviously, it only works for sounds that we can physically make. There's a lot of techno music that can't really be made outside of a computer. So unless you're taking an instrument and running it through a bajillion effects to get a specific sound, which we've seen some some electronic music that's made by acoustic instruments, and that has blown me away. but it is definitely more difficult to obtain, especially once you start looking at electronic music that 50 plus 100 plus samples in a single song. It's going to be difficult to pull that off physically. But then we see stuff like this, and I'm like, oh, even some of those sound effects that I completely attribute to the electronic sound, they have found a way to create physically, and that's just phenomenal. I absolutely love that. Um, and also, this might just be me, but I really appreciate the industrial sound using industrial equipment. Using actual metal elements in your proto metal music, in your proto industrial music is just, I mean, that's just awesome, right? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I think it's a really nice cohesion between the genre names and the actual objects being utilized to create the sound. So next, I think we need to move on to the music of it, which I'm not sure there is much to talk about here, but there is something I want to talk about is the lack of structure. According to the lyrics, we move between verse 1 to a refrain to verse 2 to a refrain, but if I were listening simply to the music, I would not feel those differences. I believe that they are categorized entirely by the lyrics and created by repetitions in words and concepts and phrases that kind of work more at separating it into something that feels more poetic. But the music did not seem to have anything that would line up with this idea of shifting ideas. The music was 5.5 minutes of the same thing. I'm not saying it was completely repetitious. I did pick up on some variations in some aspects, and I would not be surprised to find out that this might have been slightly improvised in the recording of it. That everybody kind of knew this one part of the song that needed to be played, but as long as you were doing something similar to it, you could make minor variations on the fly or minor alterations on the fly. It was all fine because honestly, there's not a lot of consonants going on in here, so you don't have to worry about everybody improvising at the same time and maybe everybody deciding to color outside the lines at the same time musically and creating some dissonance. The dissonance is built into the music. Um, and a lot of the instrumentation, even rhythmically, is not really working together in any strong notion. I would say the vocals and the drums are the closest because they seem to be a bit more rigid as far as rhythmic aspects, but the guitars are just kind of shredding it up with noise, and so there really isn't much that you need to worry about rhythmically. So yeah, like I said, I don't think this was done with improvisation in mind, but it wouldn't surprise me if I find out that it was. It definitely feels like something that could have been, and it would have allowed for some of these minor variations across the 5 minutes that helped it feel not as repetitive, not as cyclical as it could have, but also didn't allow it to feel like it went anywhere. The song really sits in one idea for the entirety of the song. And that's really all I want to touch on there as far as structure. But when we look at the instrumentation, I mean the what the individual instruments are doing, I think it's important to point out the roles. I had already mentioned that the drums and percussion are there mostly to lay down the rhythm. The vocals also work very rhythmically. They are playing off of the drums. The guitar is kind of doing its own thing as well as the metal sheet. And any other possible metal instrumentation that's going on. There's a lot of sound effects in here that work on an atmospheric level but don't really seem to fit in with anything else. Musically or rhythmically, they just every once in a while sort of exist. And it does a lot to help alter the mood of some of these sections while by basically filling up empty space and by having, when they're done, removing them and having this absence that I think is really interesting. And then of course we just have the guitar shredding it up with chaos. I don't even I have some ideas for why this is happening, but it is so far divorced from everything else that it feels its only purpose is the chaos. It's not really lining up rhythmically with the drums or the vocals or the metal percussive elements. It is sort of the sole element in its own world, where everything else is kind of working with a more of a rhythmic idea. That's not to say that they're rhythmically all over the place. It is tremolo notes that are lining up with the meter of the song and the tempo, but it like I said, it's kind of doing its own thing. If it sped up, I mean, it wouldn't really have changed much, and if it slowed down, same thing. It's kind of purpose built to add intensity and chaos and dissonance to the rest of the song. Without it, it's a rather palatable track as far as cohesion. Everything sort of lines up. There's definitely aspects to it that are not 100% perfect, right? Some of the sound effects things that they were creating with the industrial tools were, they were more ornamental, so they didn't necessarily need to line up as long as they added and embellished on the vibe that they were going for. The guitar, though, is strictly there to be noisy, and to be noisy in contrast to everything around it. It is an isolated little section there. So all of this comes together to create this chaotic vibe, and I think that's the only way to really go about describing it. It doesn't really need other words. I think chaos is perfect for this. And so it makes me immediately go to the lyrics. What in the lyrics could be describing this chaos? What in the lyrics could be playing off of this chaos? Let's look into the lyrics and see what's going on. And the lyrics are, it's a lot of repetition, which plays in so perfectly to what the music's doing. There's a lot of concepts about being stoic and being calm and collected. The verse 1 just says, "Be strong, be hard, resist temptation, close your fist, and walk the line, look straight ahead." It's very this rigid, focused, calm mentality. The refrain, both of the refrains, basically just bounce around between these ideas of being hard, flex your muscles, and be strong. And it just kind of bounces between these phrases repeatedly. And when you get back to verse 2, it says, "And come back for more, come back, flex your muscles, come back." And then we end up going to the final refrain, which goes back into that be hard, flex your muscles, be strong kind of idea. And honestly, I have no idea what's going on. Well, I should say I have no idea what their intentions are. I know what I've pulled out of this. And again, I have no idea how on the nose I am, or if I'm reading into this because of 40 years of difference. I don't know what things were like in the 80s. I wouldn't even be born for another 4.5 years after this song came out. So I certainly have no point of reference for this time period. But to me, here's what I'm reading. The lyrics are they're very focused on performative masculinity. This idea of always being in control, of being strong, of being hard in the sense that you don't let your emotions take over you. You don't show weakness. You don't show your softness. And to walk on the line and look straight ahead, to be completely focused on what you need to do. Again, this be strong, be hard, flex your muscles, be the man's man. But the repetition of it, instead of being a sort of mantra, which I suppose it could have been, I don't know. That's not my reading of it because of the music. But to me, it reads more as a directive. not a mantra. This is not something, these are not, this is not a song that I see as anthemic, as something to live by. To me, it seems to be more of an order. This is what you must do. And then I hear the music underneath it, the chaos, the raw chaos of everything, nothing really working together, right? So on the surface, we have this concept of being this manly man, right? And then under that, we have complexity, right? It starts off with a little bit of that rigidity, but eventually we add in more layers. We get the guitar in there. We get some of these, the effects that they're creating with these tools and with the metal sheet and all that, and it becomes a very complex, convoluted mess. And to me, it shows that underneath this surface level read of stoicness, there is a multi level, multifaceted person that honestly sounds confused under all of that. And to me, at least, the song reads as, uh, you know, the people who, or especially the men who are performing this masculinity and seem to be the most stable on the surface might actually have a lot of confusion and feelings and chaos within. And they don't know how to reconcile who they are with who they're supposed to show, with who they're supposed to be. And that's what I'm getting out of it. However, there is two lines in here that I don't think work well with my idea and makes me think that I'm looking at it in the wrong direction, and possibly just because, like I said, the 40-year difference. One is stick your hand in your eye, close your fist. I have no idea what that means. I really don't. Other than a very fancy way of saying blind yourself, but I'm not even sure there. And then the verse 2 introduces this idea of coming back for more, which gets implemented into the second refrain. It gets put in there against the ideas of being hard and flexing your muscles. And I'm not sure what that has to do with it. Yeah, I don't know. So it makes me think that I might be on the right track towards maybe a societal pressure and something underneath, possibly the people underneath. Um, but I don't think I'm spot on, but it's definitely my reading. It's what I got out of it. And I really enjoy hearing this message, even if it's not the intended one, coming from a song even from the 80s. I mean, it's something we're still dealing with today. It's 40 years later, we still haven't really stepped away from this idea of what it means to be masculine. So, yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed that. And this is where you guys come in, though. Hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you thought of this one, if you enjoyed it or not. If you have any context, maybe your own interpretation, your own experience with this song, or if you know what it's about, maybe they've done an interview or something, go ahead and let me know. Because like I said, I'm not as I'm not as strong in my convictions about this one as I am in some other lyrical reads that I've done before. I don't think I'm spot on. So I am kind of curious about what the artistic intention is behind this, uh, even though it will probably be different than my experience and interpretation of it. When you're done commenting, you can head up to the description box. In there is a link for Linktree. It'll take you to this menu right here. Has everything related to the channel. You can follow me on Twitter, support the channel through Patreon. You can join the Discord community, submit your own special selection. You can pick up some merch, whatever you want. It's all in there. Everything related to me or the channel above the description box if you could. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. That is it for today. That was weird. That is it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with our final Black Metal Origins week. It's going to be an interesting one. I hope, anyways. It is a Japanese black metal band. And while the album did come out in the 90s, from my understanding, they were influenced from the early 80s. Like it had finally made its way that far into the world, and they hadn't quite heard the second wave that had begun already. So I think it still fits in the Origins week, even though it technically came out during the second wave movement. But we'll see. We'll check it out tomorrow and see how closely the music relates and see if maybe it has actually been pushed into more of a second wave idea. I don't know. I haven't heard it yet. Then after that, we'll be doing a creator request as we do on every Friday, which is where a band asks for me to check out their music and to do. All right, until next time, remember to be critical but not cynical of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.